I'm Maggie. I'm a licensed clinical psychotherapist with degrees in psychology, theology, and marriage and family therapy, a national certification in dialectical behavioral therapy, and a national certification in integrative mental health. In this video, I'm not looking to diagnose anyone. I'm only willing to offer insight into situations like these. All right. In this current climate, we have a rise of these white millennial males that have a head full of misogyny, homophobia, and anti Black racism. On the internet, arguments keep getting repeated constantly. It's the same talking points, but they're deflection strategies to water down the accountability for the transatlantic slave trade and its legacy moving forward. So we're going to talk about it. But first, let me say hi to some folks who are in the room. Adric is here first. He says it's on. Adrian is here second. It wasn't on at that time. Now it's on. Leon Honeyking is here. What up to you as well? D. Scott is here. Thank you all for being here. Appreciate you guys so much. And Adric says, let's hear it for the dancing Maggies. Also, hello to all of you who are watching from the clouds. Please feel free to say hello. You can come into the chat as long as you're appropriate. Nice. Because this is the best live tribe on YouTube, bar none. You don't believe me? Talk to them. All right. So, also shout out to the replay gang. Thank you guys so much. Okay, so people often bring up these side points. Natives owned slaves. The Irish were slaves too. There's white slaves. Africans sold to Africans. Only a tiny minority of people own slaves. We keep hearing this one, right? Well, it was illegal then, and they're just a product of their time. The Civil War wasn't about slavery. All of that is to blunt accountability. The historical record is clear. U.S. chattel slavery was a legally engineered, race-based, hereditary system at a continental scale. Its profits touched every region. Black resistance and abolition alongside the war ended it, and its effects didn't vanish in 1865. We're still seeing it today. Adric says live tribe rules. Yes, it does. We rule. Exactly, Leon. Okay, so we're going to debunk these arguments together, but I'm going to ask the live tribe, the people watching, replay gang, everybody, offer information in the chat, in the comments. Give links, authors, books, articles, titles of things that you have access to. So we're going to make sure that we all have all the information possible to really shut this stuff down. Because as much as they're burning books and rewriting history and taking things out of school, people aren't accessing these things. They aren't hearing these things. So we need to share this information together. So I'm asking all of you to be a part of this conversation. Nameless, thank you for being in here. Os. All right, so we're going to start. We're going to go in reverse order. We're going to count down. Okay, so number 10, Native Americans owned slaves. So let's talk about what's true. A minority of citizens in some tribes, especially parts of what they call the 5 tribes, held Black people in slavery. Most visibly wealthy Cherokee elite did this, okay? Historian Tia Miles, it's Tiya, Miles, just like it sounds, notes that about 8% of Cherokee household heads owned enslaved people. A few planters held dozens. So this is an argument that comes up on both sides, because you will have people say, well, we need to take care of the Native Americans before we take care of the Black people. Well, Native Americans held Black people in slavery. So it doesn't need to be the oppression Olympics, right? The federal government can always find billions of dollars to do what it wants to do. It's not passing the hat to you. So the Cherokee Nation, this is the biggest one, right? Participated in a cash and trade economy by the late 1700s and the early 1800s. Okay. They sold crops, cotton, corn, and wheat. They sold livestock and timber. Some Cherokee became wealthy planters. They became wealthy merchants. They also became middlemen in trade between settlers and other tribes. Okay. They were taking advantage of this business. With that wealth, they could purchase enslaved African people through the same markets that white Southerners used. Okay. Cherokee elite adoption of slavery was partly about status and assimilation. Slaveholding was seen as a marker of being civilized. Doesn't that sound ridiculous? I'll just use the word ridiculous. Slaveholding was a marker of being civilized in the U.S. South. Wealthy Cherokees owned enslaved African people to prove parity with the white planters and to strengthen political standing. By the early 1800s, especially pre-Trail of Tears, the Cherokee elite looked very different from the full-blood Cherokee majority. Many were mixed race. They were either Cherokee and Scottish or Cherokee English, Cherokee Irish, right? These elites dominated Cherokee government and business. Some of them, like the most wealthy Cherokee man, John Ross, barely looked native at all. John Ross was 7/8 Scottish and 1/8 Cherokee. They were often slaveholders, plantation owners, and well connected to the white Southern culture because they were mostly white. So that one doesn't help, does it? It doesn't help their argument. It's still white people. Okay, so number 9. The Irish were slaves too. What about white slaves? All right, let's talk about white slaves. So, what is true? Indentured servitude did happen. Many Irish and other Europeans, including the Welsh, were bound to work as indentured servants, especially in the 1600s. It was big business then. They were often poor, coerced, or transported against their will. They were sentenced to the colonies for crimes, right? And this was especially true after the wars in Ireland. Okay, what do we do with those prisoners of war? We indenture them, okay? There were harsh conditions. Some indentured servants faced brutality, overwork, malnutrition, even death during their contracts. We don't have to embellish it and make it sound like slavery because it was bad enough. It was terrible what these people went through. However, there were contracts and limits. Okay. Servitude was contractual. It was commonly 4 to 7 years, somewhere in there. And servants had legal avenues, though limited, for redress if they were harmed. They could take their masters to court. It was not hereditary either. That was a very important point. Their children were born free. They were allowed to marry. They were allowed to have property. When the contract ended, the person was automatically free. Okay? So some Europeans, including Irish, English, Scots, and Germans, voluntarily entered into contracts because it was often the only way for a poor person to afford the passage across the Atlantic. You pay for my passage, then I will be your servant for a number of years. So here's how that worked. Ocean travel was extremely expensive at that time. Okay. By the way, Nameless is putting books in the comments, so you guys look at those when you have a chance. For those in the replay gang, you can slide over the comments to the live comments, and you'll be able to see everything that Nameless is putting in there. I have all of those except for Empire of Cotton by Sven Beckert. So definitely agree with all of those. Although The Delectable Negro is a borrowed copy, so I need to get that back. Okay, so the ocean travel was really, really expensive, okay? A would-be migrant who couldn't afford it could sell their labor, right? 4 to 7 years in exchange for the voyage to America, okay? They had freedom dues, okay? At the end of their contract, they were often promised land or tools or clothing or money. They were
paid. Land ownership in particular was a huge draw since it was hard for poor people in Europe to ever become landowners. So you sell your labor for like 7 years, and the person who wants your labor will pay for your passage to America and would give you a parcel of land at the end of your contract. Okay. Now, there is this opportunity versus exploitation thing going on because, yes, a lot of people did benefit. Many indentured servants found that promised land was in a remote or a poor quality area. Others died because of the conditions before completing their contracts, meaning their chance at land never materialized. But again, we don't have to say it was as bad as slavery. We can just tell it like it is because it was bad enough on its own. Okay? Now, here's why it's not equivalent. Hereditary enslavement. That is huge, right? In 1662, Virginia passed the doctrine of partus sequitur ventrum. Partus sequitur ventrum, right? Declaring that the status of the child followed the mother. So if the mother is in chattel slavery, is enslaved, then all of her children automatically become enslaved and automatically become the property of the master to do with as they please. Okay. This made slavery hereditary. In the other forms, it was not. Okay. For the Irish, it was not. And all those other white slaves, it was not. It was permanently locking Black children into bondage, even if their father was free or was white. That's huge, right? There was no legal exit point, okay? Unlike indentured servitude, chattel slavery was for life with no contract or legal expiration. It codified a race-based caste. So by 1705, Virginia's slave codes and similar laws across the colonies stripped Africans and their descendants of virtually all rights. They were property, banning interracial marriage, including to who? The Native American Indians, restricting mobility, and formalizing a permanent racial hierarchy. You see how this is different, okay? Their property status, right? Black people were legally defined as property. They were bought, sold, mortgaged. People put up their enslaved people to get a mortgage. Okay. They were inherited from person to person across generations. Indentured servants, while exploited and treated poorly, remained legally human subjects, right? They did have protections. Former indentured Europeans, including the Irish, could eventually assimilate into whiteness. They could gain land, they could vote, and they could hold rights denied to Africans and their descendants. It's very, very different. Leon says part of the reason they made this law was for white women of British descent not to mix with brown or Black people. The anti-miscegenation, abso-freaking-lutely. They criminalize white British women first, then Black men and women. So the bottom line is indentured servitude was harsh and it was exploitative. People could die from it, but it was temporary and non-hereditary. Okay. I myself have a great grandmother and her sister who were sold by their parents into indentured servitude. What they went through was hell. But when they became of age, they were free and they could leave. And there weren't, bands of people trying to hunt them down. Chattel slavery was legally entrenched. It was a race-based system of permanent bondage across generations. They are fundamentally not equivalent. So hopefully this comes up again for people. You're able to make that argument. All right. Number 8, Africans sold Africans, so it's on them. It's their fault. They sold them. All right, well, let's talk about what's true. All right, some African rulers and elites and brokers did capture and sell people into slavery on the continent, often from rival groups or regions. The systems of captivity, debt bondage, or enslavement already existed within Africa well before European contact. But all of those systems, including enslavement, were limited in scale. They allowed some social mobility and even eventual integration. The slavery and debt bondage that they had on the continent was very much like indentured servitude. So when these people were selling people, much like they had across tribes, sell people, by the bond, right? It was way different than what they were selling people into. And since they never came to North America, they wouldn't know that it is very different. And again, these are rival tribes. Africa is a gigantic piece of land. It is a huge continent filled with many countries, ethnicities, variations of skin tone, variations of religious beliefs, political beliefs, all kinds of things. So to say Black people sold Black people, it makes it look like you don't know the difference between one Black person and another, which is sad. How the African systems differed before the Atlantic trade. Okay. They had war captives and debt bondage. Okay. So many enslaved people in the African societies came from local wars or as like a repayment for debt. That's that bondage, right? Debt bondage. Their status definitely could be harsh, but it was not lifelong. It wasn't lifelong, wasn't hereditary. It always included a path to freedom. Enslaved people could often marry into their captor's community. So, if they were in debt bondage, if they were enslaved, and yet they met someone, they got along with them. I mean, could you imagine that none of that stuff was allowed in chattel slavery? They could marry the person and get their freedom after a set period. They also could earn money on the side and buy their own freedom. And their children definitely were not born into enslavement. They were not automatically enslaved. Enslaved people were sometimes integrated into households, definitely into military service, and a lot of times into administrative roles rather than confined solely to physical labor, plantation labor. Some slaves in African contexts resembled what Europeans call serfs or servants, or what they also called retainers, right? They are bound, yes, but with certain rights and social protections. So what's missing? There's a lot missing. I say that a lot, Adrian. Just because something is for sale doesn't mean that it has to be bought, right? Oh, well, you put it up for sale and it's on sale, clearance, 10% off, so I got to buy it. Okay. So the part that's missing, European demand. This is what Adrian is talking about. European demand drove the scale of slavery. Thank you, Adrian. I got teacher taxes. Appreciate you so much. Let me get back to these slides. Okay. So European demand drove the scale. Okay. The transatlantic slave trade was fueled and financed primarily by European powers and later by the American markets. Okay. The demand for massive plantation labor for sugar, tobacco, rice, and cotton created an unprecedented scale of human trafficking never before seen anywhere. So whenever people try to make a false equivalent, there is no equivalent. Okay? What are we saying in the comments? I just bought this baby cat. Hi, Spade Man. Thank you for being here. He's a part of the best live tribe on YouTube. All right. So he says, just look at the 1619 model I just bought. That's what it sounds like, right? Well, you put it up for sale. It's your part. Your fault. So the demand for massive plantation labor made this an unprecedented form of slavery to start. Okay. This was a huge, huge scale of human trafficking. And numbers matter. So between the 16th and the 19th century, about 12 to 13 million Africans were forcibly embarked, with around 10.7 million surviving the Middle Passage, per the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database and the Atlas of the Transatlantic Slave Trade by David Eltis and David Richardson. There was nothing on that scale ever before seen. Okay. There was a legal codification. Okay. So once in the Americas, enslaved Africans were stripped of rights through laws. As an example, the Partus Sequitur Ventrum, okay, and the 1705 slave codes that transformed these human beings into inheritable property. Again, a brand new thing we hadn't seen before. So, why the Africans sold the Africans framing is very misleading. African is so broad. Captors and captives were usually from different ethnic groups, from different kingdoms, and from different regions. It was less selling their own people than exploiting enemies, rivals, and outsiders to get paid. Okay. Without the European demand and the financing, these wars and raids would not have scaled into the largest forced migration in human history. Supply meets demand. They wouldn't have been sold if there wasn't a customer to buy them. So, yes, some Africans participated in capturing and selling captives, but the scale, financing, shipping, infrastructure, and racialized permanence of the transatlantic slave trade were created, codified, and profited from overwhelmingly by European and American power. Without Atlantic demand, the trade would not have existed as the largest forced migration in human history. So we're going to make that very clear. Hi, Alan Stanger. Thanks for being here. Okay, so let's keep going. Number 7, because we've recently heard this one, haven't we? Only a tiny fraction of white people own slaves. Only 20% of white people own slaves. So let's talk about it. There's this unequal ownership that we're talking about, right? So slaveholding wasn't universal among the Southern whites. The census-linked data shows that 1 in 5 white households, so 21% in the South, owned enslaved people in 1860, with higher rates in the deeper South. They fluctuated depending on the region, okay? There was this huge amount of concentrated wealth. Lots of plantation owners were millionaires at this time. So large planters, right, they're fewer in number, but they held the majority of enslaved people, creating this elite slaveholding class. So what's missing or misleading in this argument? It's not fringe. 21% is not a tiny fraction. In states like Mississippi or South Carolina, over 40% of white households enslaved people. Enslaved people equals massive wealth. In 1860, enslaved people were the single largest financial asset in the United States, valued at more than all the nation's banks, railroads, and factories combined. Huge. Roughly half of all Southern wealth was in enslaved human beings. That's where their wealth is tied up. So that percentage is going up, isn't it? So the 1 to 2% of Americans framing ignores that slavery was regional and not evenly distributed. Counting the whole United States population, North and South together, minimizes the impact that the South had, where slavery structured the entire economy and society. We also had the fact that the whole nation was entangled in this thing. Just because the actual enslaved people were held in the South doesn't mean the whole country and every household wasn't benefiting from this. Even Northerners who didn't own slaves directly profited. So insurance firms like Aetna, it's still around today, New York Life, still around today, wrote life policies on enslaved people. They were earning money off of enslaved people. Banks issued loans that was collateralized by enslaved people. So you default on that loan, they're selling your enslaved people to recoup their money. Okay. Textile mills in New England depended on the slave grown cotton. Okay. Universities and churches received direct proceeds from slavery. Famously, in 1838, Georgetown University sold 272 enslaved people to pay their debts. So you can't say that the North was just this innocent victim and only these very few people were enslaving people. Those were the bad guys. The entire nation was benefiting, especially in the South. But the entire nation was benefiting off of the backs of enslaved labor. Let's see. Adrian says, Maggie, I have this debate all the time. We act as if Europe would have gone away quietly if Africans would have refused to supply chattel. Call it a sale under duress. Yeah, and the interesting thing is that Europeans were still having those raiding parties into Africa. But then, because lazy, they decided it was better to just pay a lot of money to Africans and say, oh, yeah, no, we're just taking them, over here. It's fine, right? Leon says the logic of not owning anything, but my dad does logic. 1/5 of my family members owned slaves logic. Yeah. Hi, Rael. Thank you for being here. And you know what, Leon, that just goes to show that, our lineage is varied, right? And so these people who are like, I don't want my white kid to feel bad about being white. You know what? I learned about slavery in school. Didn't y'all learn about slavery in school? And I didn't immediately go, you know what? I feel so guilty about being white. No, what I said was, oh my God, that was terrible. We need to make sure that never happens again. And that's what they want to get rid of. It's crazy. Okay. So the bottom line is, while not every Southerner owned enslaved people, slavery was central to the Southern economy and deeply entangled in the nation's economy. It was not the fringe practice of some tiny elite homes. It was a structural system shaping the politics, the laws, and the wealth across the entire United States. So this 20% thing is bogus. Okay, number 6. Slavery was legal then, so you can't judge it now. People are just a product of their time. All right, so yeah, slavery was legal then. That's true, right? But what's missing? Something being legal does not make it moral. And I don't know how much more clear I can say that. Nuremberg said that. Just because something is legal does not make it moral. Being lawful never made slavery morally acceptable. Many unjust systems, including apartheid, Jim Crow, Nazi racial laws, were all legal at one time, right? At Nuremberg, at the trials from 1945 to 1946, Nazi defendants tried to argue that they followed the law of the German state. They were only following orders. The tribunal rejected this legal defense, whole cloth, ruling that crimes against humanity transcend national law. Hear me when I say this, because this is a world court. Crimes against humanity transcend national law. Morality, international norms, and human rights stand above unjust domestic laws. Period. There was always contemporary opposition. It wasn't just, modern hindsight looking back, it was wrong. There was always opposition from day one. Enslaved people resisted constantly. So they were running away, rebelling, sabotaging work, filing freedom suits every time they could. Okay. If you want an example, Elizabeth Freeman and Mum Bet in Massachusetts in 1781. Okay. Early abolitionist voices existed. The Quakers issued the 1688 Germantown Petition against slavery, the first public anti-slavery protest in the colonies. By the 1770s and 1780s, organized anti-slavery societies were appearing in Philadelphia and in London. Some states, like Vermont in 1777 and Pennsylvania in 1780, passed gradual emancipation laws. There was revolutionary rhetoric of liberty and natural rights that was directly invoked by enslaved petitioners who demanded freedom. It wasn't just hindsight is 2020. People were saying from day one, it's wrong. Okay? And again, I'm going to say it one more time. Crimes against humanity transcend national law. So, Britain outlawed the slave trade in 1807 and slavery in its empire in 1833. But Haiti abolished slavery in 1804 after a successful revolution by the enslaved people themselves. The United States was, in fact, a late holdout in abolishing slavery in 1865. So the bottom line, slavery being legal does not excuse it, either then or now. Millions knew it was wrong, and they fought against it in their own time. The Nuremberg trials made it clear that legality under domestic law cannot shield perpetrators of inhumane systems. By that standard, slavery was always a crime against humanity, even when it was legal. Let's see. Leon says slaves would protest if the masters were making pregnant women work. Adrian says, imagine that. They passed laws that favored them. Go figure. And Leon says they still do. Absolutely. All right. The next point. Oh, the one I hate to hear. The Civil War wasn't about slavery. It was about states' rights. Adrian always says states' rights to do what? Excuse me. That's where you always get it, right? States' rights to do what? All right. So what's true? Confederates did invoke their states' rights, but it was almost always in the service of protecting slavery. So the states' rights to do what? Enslave people, right? When the federal government limited slavery's expansion, when they didn't abolish it outright, but they limited it, Southern states saw this as an existential threat, and that's why they started seceding. Was the limitation was put on them. Okay, so what do the primary sources show? Primary sources believe people when they tell you who they are. Okay, Mississippi's secession declaration in 1861. Quote, our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. End quote. Believe them when they tell you who they are, right? Adrian says, it wasn't about slavery as long as you don't read the 9 letters of secession nor the cornerstone speech. Well, guess what I'm getting ready to talk about? I just quoted one of the letters, right? South Carolina's secession declaration in 1860, it complained that northern states had failed to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act, proving slavery was the flashpoint. That was one of their biggest complaints for seceding, because the North won't institute the Fugitive Slave Act and send enslaved people back to slavery, right? Texas Declaration of Secession, 1861, quote, the servitude of the African race was mutually beneficial to both bond and free, and is abundantly authorized and justified by the experience of mankind and the revealed will of the Almighty Creator. End quote. Don't tell me it wasn't about slavery. All the ones that are seceding are telling you, hey, it's literally about slavery. Okay. Alexander Stephens, the Confederate vice president in 1861, gave the cornerstone speech. Here it is, Adrian. Quote, Our new government is founded upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery is his natural and normal condition. This, our new government, is the first in the history of the world based upon this great physical, philosophical, and moral truth. End quote. First in the history of the world. So, acknowledging chattel slavery was nothing like slavery had ever been in the history of mankind, right? This is the Confederate vice president telling you it was about slavery. Okay, so why the state rights doesn't hold up. So, selective state rights, right? So, Southern leaders demanded federal enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act. That was their states' rights, which overrode the Northern states' rights to grant freedom to escaped or enslaved people. That was what the state rights were about. They wanted strong federal protection for slavery, not weak government unless it benefited them, right? Their core grievance was about slavery's expansion. The immediate trigger of secession was the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860, whose Republican Party opposed the spread of slavery into new territories. So, even though Lincoln initially pledged not to abolish slavery where it already existed, the South left anyway. The Confederate Constitution explicitly protected slavery, forbidding any law, quote, denying or impairing the right of property in Negro slaves, end quote. That's their states' rights. Okay. By 1860, enslaved people represented about $3 billion in property value. Think about that. In 1860, enslaved people represented $3 billion in property value. That was over 50% of Southern wealth. Secession documents repeatedly describe slavery as the foundation of the South's economy and social order. The bottom line is the Civil War was fought because Southern leaders seceded to protect slavery. They said so themselves, clearly, repeatedly, and officially. States' rights was the pretext. Slavery was the cause. All right, next one. Well, Black people owned slaves too, so, All right, what's true? A small minority of free Black people in the antebellum South did own enslaved people. Their motivation varied, right? There were very few examples outside of this, but most all was protective ownership. Okay. So many free Black men purchased their wives, their children, their parents, their other relatives, right, to shield them in jurisdictions where legal manumission, which is the formal freeing, was restricted or impossible. It was ridiculously expensive to pay for manumission. That kept people from doing it. So it was actually easier for free Black people to just buy their family members. In these cases, the enslaved person continued to live as family, not as exploited property, right? But on paper, yeah, they owned, right? Economic ownership was ridiculously rare. I could only find one example. So there were free Black slaveholders. This is what they tell us, but I can only find one, did own people for profit, engaging in labor exploitation like white owners. It was so anomalously rare. Okay, so here's some evidence. Larry Koger wrote Black Slave Owners, Free Black Slave Masters in South Carolina, 1790 to 1860. He wrote that in 1985. In Charleston in 1830, about 125 of the city's 3,700 free Black residents owned enslaved people. Okay. Most all of those cases involved the protective ownership. Okay. So Yeah, Adrian says the Library of Congress speaks to this. Yeah, and that's a great resource about this because they will tell you all about protective ownership. All right. The census records in 1860 across the South about 3,000 free Black individuals, which is 0.00732 of enslavers, owned enslaved people. Again, what's their proportion? 0.00732 of enslavers were Black. That's less than 1%. Okay. By contrast, about 385,000 white households, that's where you get the 21%, of white Southern households owned enslaved people. So nationwide, 3,000 free Black individuals owned enslaved people, and 385,000 white household held enslaved people. So I did have this in my notes, so I'll just repeat it. The Library of Congress confirms both protective and profit. It'll tell you about the one who did it for profit, noting the complexity, but also the extreme rarity of it. So what's missing is the scale. Free Black slaveholding was a tiny fraction compared to the vast white-controlled system. The Southern slave economy, the laws, the markets, and the profits were overwhelmingly white dominated. And there was structural inequality between the two. White law made it extremely difficult for free Blacks to manumit, right? They couldn't manumit their relatives in a lot of cases. Some white person had to manumit them, forcing some into ownership on paper, is what they called it, to protect their family. Free Black owners were always vulnerable because these owners could get re-enslaved themselves or expelled completely out of their states, and people just would take their family members back. So no dilution of responsibility. All right. A few exceptional cases don't alter the fact that chattel slavery was designed, codified, and enriched for white elites. It's not the same. False equivalence. Okay. So the bottom line is, yes, a small number of free Black people owned enslaved people, sometimes even for profit, but most cases were attempts to protect loved ones under the hostile legal regimes. The scale, laws, and profits of slavery were overwhelmingly white controlled, and pointing to the rare Black owner does nothing to absolve the 385,000 households that owned enslaved people in a white dominated system. And again, $3 billion, lots of millionaires. All right, next one. Number 3. Slavery happened everywhere. There's nothing unique about the United States. You know, every race has been enslaved at some point in time. You know, this is a little throwback to the white slaves, right? Well, let's talk some more about general slavery versus United States slavery. Okay, slavery did exist globally. Across Africa, Europe, and the Middle East, and in Asia, slavery was common. Often it was temporary, it was conditional, it was most often prisoners of war, people in debt bondage, or servitude for crime, right? Your sentence was to serve, to be enslaved. So people could sometimes gain their freedom, and their children were not automatically enslaved. That was global slavery. All right. US slavery is very distinct, very distinctive. So, number 1, racialization and hereditary statutes. So, laws explicitly tied slavery to Blackness. So, you know, those indigenous tribes who were Black Indians, oh, they just got rewritten and rewritten and redesignated as Negro so they could be enslaved, right? Because it was always tied to Blackness. 1662 Virginia law, the partus sequitur ventrum, right? Children inherited their mother's enslaved status regardless of the father. This created a permanent generational caste. This was brand new, very different. The legal codification. 1705 Virginia slave codes codified Black people as property, limited their rights, and sanctioned harsh punishment. Anti-miscegenation laws prohibited the interracial marriage, so they couldn't get out of it, further cementing racial boundaries. Remember what I said before? Enslaved people could marry out of being enslaved. You couldn't do that in chattel slavery. The scale and economy was huge for chattel slavery. The U.S. plantation slavery involved continent-wide operations, producing cash crops, tobacco, rice, indigo, and cotton. The transatlantic slave trade brought 12 to 13 million Africans to the Americas, 10.7 million that survived. No other slavery system matched this scale, racial targeting, and legal permanence. False equivalence again, right? Bottom line, slavery existed everywhere, but the U.S. developed a legally entrenched, race-based hereditary system on an unprecedented scale. This is what made it historically and socially distinct from that slavery that happened everywhere, right? All right, next one. Oh, we're at number 2. White people ended slavery, and now you get to be here in the United States by us. Aren't you happy? Say thank you. That's all I hear when people say that. Now tell me thank you, right? So Black resistance doesn't get talked about. Black resistance was decisive. Everywhere enslaved people resisted. Everywhere. Okay. They running away, revolting, work slowdown, sabotage, cultural persistence. Resistance was constant, not occasional. There was always something to resist. The Haitian Revolution from 1791 to 1804, the enslaved Africans in Santo Domingo successfully overthrew French colonial rule, creating the first Black-led republic in the Americas. This revolution sent shockwaves through the Atlantic world, challenging the assumption that slavery was unbreakable. That's Black people ending slavery, okay? The U.S. context, Black people organized rebellions. Got Nat Turner, Denmark Vesey, Gabriel Prosser, right? And daily acts of resistance that always kept the fight alive. Black soldiers and activists made abolition possible. The U.S. Civil War, nearly 180,000 Black men served in the Union Army, okay? They were in the United States Colored Troops. Plus, thousands of Black people worked as sailors, laborers, and as spies. Their service was crucial to the Union victory and the emancipation effort. There was always abolition activism going on. Black leaders like Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, and countless others pressured governments, organized escapes, and shifted public opinions, right? This was coalitional, not unilateral. White abolitionists participated. Sure, they did. There were lots of them. But without the Black people leading that, the Black struggle, the self-liberation, and the sacrifice, slavery would have persisted much longer. Framing abolition as a gift from white people is like punching someone, then taking credit for cleaning their bloody nose. It ignores who bore the pain and who fought to remove the chains. The bottom line is Black agency was central, not peripheral, in ending slavery. White abolitionists were allies, not the engine of freedom. All right, let's go to number 1. It was so long ago. It ended in 1865. Let it go. Why are you talking about it now? Well, the legacy of slavery did not vanish with the 13th Amendment. Its structures evolved, influencing social, economic, and political realities today. Okay, so number 1, legal and carceral continuity. The 13th Amendment of 1865 abolished slavery, quote, except as punishment for a crime, end quote. The United States didn't abolish slavery. It said you can't do slavery unless somebody commits a felony, then you can enslave them. This loophole enabled black codes in southern states to criminalize minor offenses like loitering, vagrancy, and unemployment was a crime, to re-enslave black people through forced labor. Thank you so much, Adric. He's patiently waiting on that 40 acres and a mule that they were promised, right? So black people became, they got arrested. They were found guilty of a felony and re-enslaved. But now they're called a prisoner. They're called a felon, not a slave. And then they used convict leasing. So black prisoners were leased to private businesses. Oh, we have these enslaved people who needs work done, right? They leased them to mining companies and farms, replicating all the plantation conditions. Same thing, different name. This system persisted well into today. The private prison system has government contracts. Modern mass incarceration disproportionately affects Black communities, a direct echo of this legal structure. So, number 2, economic exclusion and asset diversion. So, redlining from 1930s onward. The Homeowners Loan Corporation and Federal Housing Administration, that's the FHA, mapped neighborhoods by race, denying Black families mortgage access and limiting home ownership and wealth accumulation. 1 second, guys. Sorry, I got to pull this up and clear my throat. Okay, so limiting home ownership and wealth accumulation. How do we accumulate wealth? Property ownership, right? That's we should know that. Okay, the GI Bill discrimination post World War II. White veterans received low interest loans, education funding, and suburban housing opportunities, while Black veterans were often blocked by local administrations and discriminatory lenders. So they didn't get their GI Bill. Then we had segregated labor markets. So Black workers were systematically excluded from high-wage, unionized jobs, reinforcing the intergenerational poverty. Leon says the stories of the mining companies are crazy. A father who saw his son enter and pass away before him. I'm sure it was absolutely terrible. All right, number 3, persistent wealth gaps. Studies from the Federal Reserve, Brookings, and the Urban Institute showed dramatic disparities in the median white household wealth, right? So the median white household wealth is roughly 5 to 10 times greater than the median Black household wealth in the United States. That's today. So if you were never able to build wealth, to gain property, to get the education, that's how we are where we're at now. The home ownership gap and inheritance patterns trace directly to exclusion from historic asset building programs. Intergenerational compounding means today's economic inequalities are tied to historical structural racism originating in what? Slavery. The legacy continues. Number 4, societal and cultural impacts. Education and school funding is tied to property taxes, right? So redlining created unequal education opportunity for Black children. They tied it to property taxes for that very reason. Health outcomes, historical deprivation, and systemic discrimination contribute to higher rates of chronic illnesses, maternal mortality, and life expectancy gaps in Black communities. And political disenfranchisement. Post-Reconstruction voter suppression, because of poll taxes and literacy tests and intimidation, just being mean, shaped long-term civic underrepresentation. The bottom line is slavery may have ended legally in 1865, but its structures just morphed into new forms. The legal, economic, social forms that continue to shape Black life today. That is the legacy. So, we are living in a moment where political power is increasingly influencing education, media, and public discourse, often in ways that reshape or erase historical truths. This has direct implications for how Black history and the legacy of slavery are understood. All right. Adrian says, Maggie, you probably mentioned this, but we often overlook the fact that several families had their land taken by their white neighbors in the time period between 1865 and World War II, and that creates quite a gap. I did not mention that, so thank you so much for bringing that up. Land rush, right? The Sooners. Okay, so media and speech play into this. Reports show increasing government and corporate influence over media narratives, including pressure on journalists and content moderation that can punish dissenting voices. Just look at what happened to Kanye and recently Jimmy Kimmel. Employees and public figures are sometimes fired or censored for expressing views that challenge dominant narratives, creating a climate where certain historical truths or social critiques are discouraged. I don't know if this is true, but I heard of a woman getting fired for posting up Charlie Kirk's own quote. She quoted him and she got fired. Our education system and our curriculum is also controlled. States have enacted or proposed laws restricting teaching of critical race theory, slavery, and systemic racism in public schools. They weren't going to teach critical race theory anyway. That's a college level class. Some policies ban certain books or require selective history curricula, effectively removing Black history or sanitizing the legacy of slavery and segregation, calling it forced migration. Museums, cultural institutions, and historical sites face political pressure to downplay or revise exhibits that confront systemic oppression or highlight Black resistance. We recently had this with Trump, changing things that are in the museum. Interesting. Leon says they poured chemicals on my great-grand family's land in Mississippi so they couldn't grow anything. I'm sorry about that. Okay. We have this shaping narrative of public perception happening. Efforts to recast Black Americans as responsible for their own social problems shift blame from historical and structural inequities to individual or group behavior. Why are only Black people policed? What is this respectability politics that we have? White people act just as bad as the worst Black person. And the same goes for any other race. But why is it always judged when it's a Black person? And then, oh, see, that's why all these bad things happen to you. Why are you hitting yourself? This narrative erasure masks the persistent effects of slavery, segregation, and discriminatory policies, making it easier to justify contemporary policies that maintain that inequality. There are strategic consequences to this, okay? We have intergenerational memory loss, right? Without accurate historical education, younger generations may not understand the roots of systemic inequality. This is why I say, I learned about slavery in school. My initial thought was, that's terrible. We need to make sure that doesn't happen again. But now we're missing out on this, okay? Misrepresenting history allows governments and policymakers to ignore structural solutions, treating inequities as personal failings rather than consequences of systemic oppression. By framing Black communities as the enemy, right? We have this Black people are certain part of the the population, they commit all these different crimes. Yeah, but when you look at white people, it's even worse. White people commit the most crimes in any category. So, by framing Black communities as the enemy or as primarily responsible for social problems, these narratives polarize society and undermine coalitional movements for equity. So the bottom line is this: there is a concerted effort to control historical narratives through media, education, and cultural institutions, which threatens to erase American history, obscure the true legacies of slavery, and shift blame onto the very communities who suffered under systemic oppression. Understanding and confronting these efforts is essential for preserving our United States history, for preserving the truth, and for achieving equity. That's what I got today. Let me take this off of here. All right. So I appreciate you guys being here, for all of the information that you put in the chat. To the replay gang, I'm looking forward to all of the information that you put in the chat. It's very, very important that we all have this information because, again, this is part of our United States history. It's important to know our history, right? All right, so coming up this Wednesday, we're going to continue. Leon says Maggie per capital 1,000 per capita 1,000. The ratio. Oh yeah, per capita. That's what they. Yeah, per capita. So they always say. So this coming Wednesday, we're going to continue with the Keys of the Book of Knowledge, the Keys of Enoch by J.J. Hurtak. We're going to be going through that still. We're actually getting close to done. We've only got a few more weeks to go, and then we will have gotten through that gigantic book. So, and then next Sunday, trying to remember what the show is about. I haven't posted it up yet. Oh, I know what it was. Being Black is not a crime. And we're actually going to talk about, because you know how I talked about Nuremberg today, we're going to talk a little bit about the UN Council and different councils that are happening in different countries and in the United States. So it's a bit of a different take than what we've talked about before. So it will be called Being Black is Not Illegal. So if I don't see you this coming Wednesday, I hope to see you next Sunday. And before I forget, I love you, I miss you, and you're my favorite. Now I'm going to show you a picture of my dog.
Please like the video if you haven't already. It really helps the algorithm to know what kind of things you like. Share where you think it's appropriate, especially to someone who you think needs to hear it. And don't forget to check out some of the wilder Pivot Point Wednesday shows. And last, don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, especially if you want to break down complex concepts that make the esoteric not so teric, helping you on your journey to become your most authentic self. By subscribing, you'll join a community that thrives on curiosity and growth, and you'll never miss out on insights and some wild discussions. Let's uncover the universe together.